Welcome to the Future Christian Podcast, your source for insights and ideas on how to lead your church in the 21st century. At the Future Christian Podcast, we talk to pastors, authors, and other faith leaders for helpful advice and practical wisdom to help you and your community of faith walk boldly into the future. Whether you're a pastor, church leader, or a passionate member of your faith community, this podcast is designed to challenge, inspire, and equip you with the tools you need for impactful ministry. And now for a little bit about the guest for this episode.
Welcome to the Future Christian Podcast. Today, Martha Tatarnic welcomes the Most Reverend Shane Parker, Primate of the Anglican Church of Canada. Archbishop Shane Parker was elected the 15th Primate of the Anglican Church of Canada in June of 2025 and installed at St. Paul's Cathedral, London, Ontario. Prior to being elected, he had served as Bishop of the Anglican Diocese of Ottawa since 2020, and before that he was Dean of Diocese of Ottawa and Rector of Christ Church Cathedral for 2 decades. Born to Irish parents in Edmonton, Alberta, he grew up in Western Canada. He worked as a laborer for several years before embarking on undergraduate and graduate studies in sociology at Carleton University. After working as a professional sociologist, he studied theology at St. Paul University and was ordained as a priest in 1987 in the Diocese of Ottawa, later serving as a diocesan archdeacon. Archbishop Parker has an honorary doctorate from St. Paul University, where he served as a part-time professor of pastoral ministry and chairs its Anglican Studies Advisory Committee. A collection of his pastoral essays was published by Novalis in a book called Answering the Big Questions. He's a recipient of the Interfaith Ottawa Award for devoted service to promoting interfaith dialogue and cooperation. Archbishop Parker is married to Catherine Shadbolt, a lawyer specializing in family law and mediation. He has 3 adult children and 3 grandchildren. He is handy, enjoys physical work, and is most comfortable in natural places. A reminder before we start today's conversation, please take a moment to subscribe to the podcast, leave a review, and share Future Christian with a friend. You can connect with Lauren, Martha, and Future Christian on Instagram. You can send us an email at lauren@resonatemediapro.com and find us on Substack at Future Christian Podcast. We appreciate your voice and how we faithfully discern the future of the church.
Welcome to the Future Christian Podcast. I am your host for today, Martha Tatarnic, and today I am very happy to be having a conversation with Archbishop Shane Parker, who is the presiding bishop or the primate of the Anglican Church of Canada. Welcome, Archbishop. Thank you for making time to be with us on Future Christian today.
Thank you, Martha. Good to be here.
So we are going to just start with a couple of opening questions to help our listeners get to know you a little bit. These are questions that we ask all of our guests. And the first thing that would be great to know is a little bit about the faith context in which you were raised.
Okay. So I'm the child of Irish immigrants who were very much a part of the Church of Ireland tradition, which is the Anglican Church in Ireland. And my father joined the Canadian military and we moved around a lot, and church was the one constant as I was growing up. We were always a member of an Anglican parish from my earliest memories. So I'm very much a cradle Anglican, but not necessarily a cradle Canadian Anglican, because there is that strong influence from the Church of Ireland.
Okay. All right. That's really interesting. So, just in broad brushstrokes, how has being a Christian changed for you from then until now? Would there be just a couple of things that you would note?
Well, I think the major change would be the place of Christianity within Canadian society, the place of the Anglican Church in Canadian society, the place of confessed religious faith. When I was a child living on the prairies, we would begin the day in assembly with Christian hymns.
Right.
I remember an inventory being taken of everyone's church affiliation. And apart from very, very few people, everyone could identify where they were from. And now, of course, that's just not part of most people's DNA, most people's identity, certainly not something that's called upon or recognized as being significant and important in our society at this time. So that's a major change.
Yeah, that certainly is a major change. And I think that will be very much connected to some of the conversation that we're going to drill into a little bit more deeply here as we go along. And certainly as we set the stage for what actually your role is in the Anglican Church and how you got into that role. So if our listeners are chomping at the bit to find out a little bit more about who you are and what you are doing and leading, don't worry, we're going to get to that. Just one more opening question. Is there a spiritual practice that you're finding particularly meaningful now? And, again, just for our listeners, this is a brand new role for you. And so it's a time of pretty big transition in your life personally. I wonder if there is a faith practice that you're finding kind of grounding in this time of transition.
Yeah. So a few short months ago, I was the bishop of the Anglican Diocese of Ottawa, completely connected to a community in a different parish every week and part of a church I'd belonged to for many, many years. And now I am not the bishop of a diocese. I am living in downtown Toronto for the time being. And I found that the personal prayer disciplines are what I've turned to in the absence of being part of a fixed liturgical community of any kind. I'm the kind of person who I wouldn't want to overstate the notion of praying without ceasing, but I'm very conscious and aware of the creator of creation being around me, within me. And my personal prayer disciplines, the morning and evening prayers, as well as a conversation with God throughout the day, have really become my discipline at this time until I find a new rhythm of what it means to be, in a sense, outside of a liturgical community that gathers regularly.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. There's so many of the guests that we have on this podcast that name the daily office as a really important spiritual practice, and guests from a variety of different denominations and traditions. But so often that is part of what gets named, is that sense of being able to be part of a community even when you're by yourself or not with a physical gathering.
Something I'm very, very conscious of are the prayers of the church. I'm aware that I am being prayed for because of my role and so on. And sometimes it's almost like a physical sense of being supported by that. And sometimes I just let myself lean into that in a quiet kind of way, just knowing when I can't pray, I'm being prayed for.
Yeah, that's really beautiful. Thank you. Okay, so we are going to just spend a little bit of time setting a bit of a roadmap of how you got from A to B into this new role as Primate or presiding bishop of the Anglican Church of Canada. This is for the benefit of our non-Anglican listeners, but as I was saying to you just before we pressed record on the podcast, it's also for lots of our Anglican listeners because the nitty-gritty of how the Anglican Church is actually structured is not always foremost on people's minds or, just in their easily accessible knowledge bank. So if you could just start by telling us a little bit about when and where you were ordained, where you have served, and when you were elected bishop, what that part of your journey looked like.
So I was ordained into the Anglican Church as a priest in 1987 in the Diocese of Ottawa. And I served as a parish priest for many years until 1995, when I became the diocesan archdeacon. That's sort of the assistant to the bishop, basically, like an executive assistant to the bishop, you might say. And I served in that role for 4 years and then was appointed as the Dean of Christ Church Cathedral in Ottawa. That's the cathedral where royal commemorative services are held and other things. It's well known to many Canadians. And I served in that job until 2020. So I was just over 20 years as the Dean of Christ Church Cathedral in Ottawa. And I was elected as Bishop of the Anglican Diocese of Ottawa on March 14th, 2020, quite literally the day before the world shut down.
Oh my gosh, it sure was.
Yeah. And served in that role for almost exactly 5 years until General Synod, which is the National Assembly or the primary governing body of the Anglican Church of Canada, convened in London, Ontario in June. And at that time, I was elected to serve as primate. It was not something I had sought in any way. I was not on the ballot, but there was a request for more names during the meeting. The General Synod has the right to ask for more names if for whatever reason. And I found myself very quickly nominated and very quickly elected to serve in this role.
Okay, so I do want to circle back to that piece in a moment, but just before we do, because I think that discernment piece could be really interesting for our listeners. But before we get to that, let's just flesh out a bit for people what the role of the primate actually is in the Anglican Church of Canada. I think there can be a lot of misunderstanding about what your role is, what authority you do have, what authority you don't have. If you can just kind of give us a brief job description.
So the word primate comes from the phrase primus inter pares, which means first among equals. So the primate is first among equals amongst the bishops of the Anglican Church of Canada. That's why I hold the title Archbishop. As the primate, there are two spheres of authority, you might say. One sphere relates to the not-for-profit organization called the National Office of the General Synod of the Anglican Church of Canada. And in that sphere, I basically function as the chief executive officer. So I am principally responsible as a CEO for the organization of the National Office of the Anglican Church of Canada. The second sphere is as the senior metropolitan or senior archbishop of the Anglican Church of Canada. And that has two dimensions to it. On the one hand, I am the spiritual head of the Anglican Church of Canada. I can speak for the Anglican Church of Canada, and I bring the Anglican Church of Canada to really wherever I am, in a sense. And part of that would be in civic contexts, part of it would be ecumenical or interfaith, but a good part of it would be within the Anglican Communion, the worldwide Anglican Church, which is about 85 million people. So as primate, I'm a member of a body called the Primate's Meeting, which is one of the instruments of communion within the Anglican Church. The primates from across the world gather together, bringing their provinces, as they're called, and we have bonds of affection and relationships that enable the Anglican Communion to hold together, to be in relationship. Within Canada, my authority as an archbishop is quite limited. A lot of people don't understand that. Mm-hmm. The Anglican Church of Canada, I believe, is the only jurisdiction where the primate does not have direct authority over bishops. That direct authority rests with the four metropolitans, or archbishop of the four internal provinces of the Anglican Church of Canada. So when the primate shows up for a consecration of a bishop, the primate does not take the role of the chief consecrator. The metropolitan does, because the metropolitan has direct authority over those bishops. The primate would have influence, moral influence, and our rules are such that if there is a matter of discipline that is appealed beyond the metropolitans, then the primate presides at the Supreme Court of the Anglican Church of Canada. So the primate has what we might call moral influence, spiritual influence in terms of authority over bishops and dioceses, but does not have direct supervisory legal authority over the dioceses of each of the internal provinces. That rests with the metropolitan. So that's a little bit confusing for people. People often think that the primate can go and, discipline within a diocese or whatever. In fact, that's not the case. It would be a little bit like the justice of the Supreme Court not being prohibited from exercising their role within a provincial superior court, for example. Our rules are what they are. So the primate, as the senior metropolitan in Canada, is a symbol of unity. The primate has a direct role in being a pastor to the bishops of the Anglican Church of Canada, and exercises that role and other roles to promote unity, to draw the church together. The primate presides at meetings of General Synod and the Council of General Synod and so on. So it's not quite an honorary role, but it would be more like the Governor General than the Prime Minister, to use a Canadian political context.
Okay, I think that's helpful. I think that, it's even for people in my congregation or in our Anglican congregation, sort of understanding that in terms of like oversight and authority, our diocesan bishop has a great deal of local authority, whereas you don't really, not in the way I think that people sometimes assume.
Not the way people would understand it. It's not the same as a diocesan bishop in that sense. A diocesan bishop is, she or he would have direct authority over their priests, can authorize things, can discipline, and so on. It's not as clear-cut that way.
Yeah. Okay. So let's circle back to this summer when you were elected the primate of the Anglican Church of Canada. And, you talk about everything happening in kind of quick succession, that you were not on the ballot, but then more names were asked for, and then you were on the ballot, and then you were elected. But let's kind of widen that lens a little bit, because you have talked in interviews about having some kind of inkling going into General Synod, that I know that there's kind of a piece around whether or not you were going to pack your mitre, which was sort of related to that. Maybe just some kind of sense that this could be on the table. Can you just talk a little bit about the discernment process? What did that look like for you?
Sure. So I think it's important for people to realize when there's an episcopal election, whether it's for a primate or a diocesan bishop, people are called to be candidates. They're not called to be a bishop. They're called to consider whether they would let their name stand. Mm-hmm. And to do that would mean that they'd be prepared, if called by the church in the power of the Holy Spirit to serve, they would be ready to stand. So there is a point of discernment with respect to whether or not to allow yourself to serve as a candidate, to allow your name to be on the ballot. And when the primacy became vacant, there was a process in place. It's very clear how it works. The nominations need to be received by the acting primate or the general secretary, and it's the House of Bishops who nominates people. Okay, so in the Anglican Church, the General Synod has three orders: the order of bishops, the order of clergy, and the order of laity. The order of bishops provide a list of names and those of nominees, and those nominees are then voted on by the order of clergy and laity. So bishops themselves do not vote for the primate. They simply provide the list of nominations.
Right.
And so at the April meeting of the House of Bishops, that is where the list of nominees would be prepared. So I had been approached by many people from different parts of the country, unrelated to one another, starting last fall, essentially, when it became clear this was happening. Overtures happened, looking for expressions of interest, and I had no sense of peace about letting my name stand. I am 67 years old now. I've had a wonderful career, and I just did not feel within myself called to let my name stand.
Right.
Had no spark of interest or anything like that at all. I recognize that this particular triennium, the 3-year period between general synods, would be extremely challenging. Our church faces a lot of major issues, and I did not feel that at this stage of my life, that was where I needed to be putting my energy. So because it's necessary for bishops in our church to retire at 70, I had been entertaining a personal plan to perhaps step down sometime within the next 2 years, to retire and to live a quiet and peaceable life, as we say. And so it was a difficult discernment, very difficult discernment as to whether I would let my name stand. Sometimes we hear the call of God through the voices of other people. And there were a number of voices, people I respect greatly, who raised with me the prospect of letting my name stand. And I simply did not have a sense of peace about it. I could not see myself doing it. And that stayed with me. I did not feel I could put my name forward in a way that came from the depths of my being with absolute sincerity, that I could do the video shoot, I could write answers to the questions in a way that was profoundly authentic. That was not there for me at all. However, the voices of encouragement were. So in April, at the House of Bishops, the final discernment happened, and I made a decision that I would not let my name stand. It was not there for me, and I was at peace with that. And it went away. It went away, and it was nice not to have that difficult discernment playing in my head as it had for months in advance. Yeah. And then as we narrowed into General Synod, I had a foreboding that there may be a request for more names and that I may have to revisit or be obliged to revisit the decision to let my name stand. And I was not in the mix, had no intention of doing so, had done some discernment in the form of, there was a request, those in the House of Bishops who may be willing to stand if more names are requested, maybe you could just fill in the basic form and so on. I played with that, not terribly seriously, but did not submit the form, did not give permission for it to be in the mix until the day of the election. And that morning I woke with just a deep sense of spiritual agitation, you might say. I had this sense that it was going to come to me to make that decision. And I spoke with my wife, Catherine, and she said something which was she said, I don't think you can make that decision. I think you need to let the church make the decision. And it just struck me deeply that, yes, I'm trying to control something, thinking that it was all about my decision to stand or not stand. And something shifted where I realized I need to let go of something here. My resistance is consuming me. I did not have peace of mind. And then during the Eucharist, I found a sense of equanimity. At this point, there had not been a request for names. It could have easily been the case there wasn't, but you just kind of get a sense sometimes, that something might be coming your way. And then when the call for more names came, that was when I relinquished. It was both painful and a relief at the same time. I knew what I would be letting go of. And at that point, I just had this sense that, this is probably going to be you, and that was not a nice sense at all. It was not a nice sense. But once I relinquished, a sense of groundedness took over, you might say. And when the voting happened in short order and I was elected, I was prepared for that, you might say. It was powerful. It was a powerful moment. And so that's the story, Martha, of the discernment.
Well, I really appreciate your sharing that, because although it's a pretty specific story that most people are not going to experience the details
Call
of.
is not a specific thing. Call is
like
we all face. Yeah.
There's just parts of that I relate to so deeply, and I'm sure people across a whole bunch of different contexts would relate to, especially that piece around trying to control something and having to surrender control. I mean, I think that is just like at the heart of so many call stories.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, thank you. That's some very personal sharing, and I really appreciate that for our listeners.
One thing I've learned over the years that might be helpful for people is sometimes we're called to stay. We're often so forward oriented that I need to do something next, and I'm called to do something. And in my experience, we're often called to stay, and that's a very hard discernment.
Yeah.
To stay the course, it's not exciting in some ways. And anyway, I just offer that as well.
Yeah. I think that's a really helpful guidepost as well. Thank you. Okay, so let's talk about the future of the Anglican Church of Canada. You alluded to a variety of challenges that face us as a church. And again, although our listeners aren't exclusively Anglican by any means, our listeners come from a variety of traditions. I do think that there are things that the Anglican Church is facing that are going to be relatable and recognizable for people across a variety of traditions. So I think getting your eyeballs on some of these questions could be really helpful across the board. So why don't we just start by talking about the fact that you have been in ordained ministry for close to 4 decades, and you have served as both a priest and a bishop, as you noted. In those different contexts, what have you seen as the greatest challenges that the church is currently navigating?
I think a central challenge is that our place in the broad spectrum of our context. And I want to acknowledge that context is very important. The Anglican Church of Canada is in itself extremely diverse. It has membership from coast to coast to coast. It's in intense urban environments. It's in very wild, remote, wonderful environments. It's rural and everything else. So context is important. So when we say challenges, each context will present its own challenges. But I believe there are some underlying things. Foremost would be the falling away of religious belief as a primary variable in the lives of Canadians, in the life of Canadian society. I described earlier being a child in the 60s. Most people had some sort of affiliation that was acknowledged. Those were the days when if you built a church, you knew that there was already a population around that church who was keen to have it. There would be a mortgage and so on. The post-war period was a bit of a boom period in terms of the building up of a lot of mainline churches. And the simple truth is that we're still living on many of the structures and much of the culture of that post-war period, but everything has changed around us. Everything has changed around us. And a great challenge is to, first of all, see and understand that our place and how that impacts us has changed profoundly, but we have not guided change in a way that allows us to meet the changed context. So in other words, we have been changed by circumstance. We've not chosen to guide change very effectively in most contexts. And so we at one time would have had in the Anglican Church, and I believe it's true for other churches, our own sense of identity, our sense of self, our sense of importance was a fairly easy win. Our structures were big and strong for the most part, and we referenced ourselves as we did our business. We didn't always reference society because we didn't need to, because society was not telling us anything other than, hey, it's great that you are who you are. Perfect.
Yeah.
Great. Knock yourselves out,
Yeah.
There's a lot of affirmation, acceptance. It was just
thanks
part
for
of
coming
the
out.
fabric. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
All that changed. When I was appointed as the Dean of Ottawa in 1999, all three levels of government in the city of Ottawa were represented at that event. It was covered in the newspaper. It was major news that the Anglican Church in the fabled Christchurch Cathedral had a new dean.
Right.
When I was elected bishop, notwithstanding the fact it was during the pandemic, there was absolutely no secular coverage of the event. None whatsoever. Not a peep. And I don't take that personally, but in Ottawa, I was not someone who had a low profile. I was involved in lots of things, quite well known in the community, but it was simply of no interest. It wasn't newsworthy. I would say when I was elected primate, there was no coverage of that event either, even in the city of Ottawa, where I'm from. Okay.
That's pretty
now, again,
telling.
I don't take that personally, but that is significant in terms of the place we have. We did, because we're good at ceremonial, the Christchurch Cathedral in the nation's capital, worked with Heritage Canada to orchestrate some beautiful commemorative services for the late Prince Philip and Queen Elizabeth II. Valued because we know how to process, we know how to stage those types of ceremonies, but it was not because we were Anglicans and had a cathedral and everyone thought that's where it should be. It's because we were there and the Queen is an Anglican and it was the right thing to do. Glad to do it. Our tradition as Anglicans is such that we could craft a state ceremony in a way that allowed different expressions of faith or no faith to be part of the liturgy and so on. But moving away from that back to the point, many churches have not accepted or recognized or studied or analyzed the context that has changed them, right? And how do we speak in that context? How do we evangelize in a context where we accept religious pluralism and in many ways celebrate different faith traditions? What does that mean? How does that work? How do we measure our success, you might say, in a context where the growth of churches is almost an oxymoron? So that's a huge challenge. It's the recalibrating of who we are as Anglicans, who we are as Christians, who we are as other people of faith in a context that does not celebrate our existence or recognize it, or in some cases even know about it. Right?
Yeah.
So that context changes us. We see it expressed in declining attendance and participation. We see it expressed in not having a natural presence in media and so on, right? So the question becomes, how do we live out our faith in a context that exerts itself us in ways that diminishes us or causes us to change, causes us to shrink, while we're holding up structures we've been living in and with for 50, 60 years, right? So the challenge is to guide change. how do we guide change? What markers do we hold on to from the past, if any? What is important? How do we relate to the world around us? Do we want to be seen as the object of charity? Come to our garage sale, come to our fundraiser so we can pay for our costs. Is that how we want to position ourselves? Or do we want to do the necessary restructuring and the consolidating and the drawing together and leveraging our assets and resources to be basically as financially independent and viable as possible? So what we present to our context is, we don't want anything from you. We're here to serve. Mm-hmm. We're compelled to serve because God is love, and God compels us to make everything good for everybody, right? And just and true. We need to present that to the world around us, that we actually don't want anything. We're here to offer. We're here to serve in partnership in ways that are sensitive. And to quote St. Francis, preach the gospel always, if necessary, use words. How do we display by our actions, by our posture, that we are not the object of charity? We don't want to get inside your heads and pull you into something that, we will meet you where you are as Christ did, and we will serve as Christ did from a place of love.
Yeah, truly. I mean, you've said a lot there, and I guess there are a couple of threads I want to pull on. But first of all, to say that, I think you would be hard-pressed to find anybody who is serving in ministry right now, kind of in any capacity in the church, who doesn't feel that sense of weight of the institutional baggage that we are sort of carrying around.
And feeling the effects of change being exerted on you instead of guiding it. Yeah.
Yeah, truly. And, I also just want to say, like, my co-host Lauren and I are big fans of the work of Andrew Root, and he would kind of go like one step further in terms of what that change looks like. It's a very basic spiritual change. Like, how do you communicate the living God to a society that primarily doesn't think on that transcendental plane, that is, formed to think in terms of, the secular reality. So, just that basic communication piece of who is this God, and how do we recognize God's work in our lives, and why does that matter? I mean, that basic piece is also just such a barrier in terms of the church having something meaningful to speak into the world.
Yeah, very much so. And, that's where we have to check what is important for us to say. What we think is important, and how we're heard, and how language plays out. I'm not suggesting for a minute that we sort of water down the power of the gospel. In fact, I would say quite differently that I believe our liturgies, the formality of our liturgies, the different language of our liturgies is actually an attractive thing, to make liturgy, super accessible, to make it feel like every other type of gathering that happens in society is not necessarily the way to go. Why would you want more symmetry with the culture around you? Do you not want to offer something that is a respite from that, and so on? So having humble confidence in the best of our traditions is important. At the same time, the language we use to express the living God beyond our context, we have to understand how that's heard. And to consider whether the words are more important, the religious terminology is more important than words which express our deepest faith. So the language of justice, the language of love, the language of compassion, of reconciliation, those are words that mean things across cultures, across religions, and of course they express the nature of God.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. Okay, I'd like to just take a bit of a sidestep. I want to come back to some of those pieces that you named briefly around what does need to change, and how we do need to think about our resources and who we are and why that matters. But again, as somebody who has served in a variety of levels of leadership in the church, I'm curious to hear from you how you see the impact on church leaders of trying to minister in times of such exceptional change, where in so many ways we're trying to pretend as if the change isn't happening. What are your observations for church leaders, again, like both ordained and lay people?
So it's very important to understand what business are you actually in, right? Like what are you supposed to be doing? And we come, especially, in the post-Second World War period, from the idea that you do programs. Mm-hmm. You do things, and that's really important. If people come to your programs and all that, and I'm not knocking that is important. But if you find that you are trying to engineer activities that are attractive to a bunch of people, and that's why you exist, you might be missing something really important, because perhaps what matters is community. What matters is people gathering in a space where there's a degree of familiarity, both in terms of the physical space, the people, the liturgy, the music, and so on. It's a place of respite. And to lift up, our worship, our times of gathering. For most of us, that's 2 or 3 hours on a Sunday morning. That's the principal engagement people have with their church communities. The programs that happen during the week, depending on context, for sure are important. But worship and pastoral care are highly relational things. And they are about being a community of faith from birth to death, which will care for you, which will know who you are, know your story, and receive you. These are unique propositions in our society. I don't know of any other body which gathers people together on a weekly basis, intergenerationally, multiculturally, to listen to values that directly benefit the common good, to sing together, to have intergenerational relationships, to be able to care for one another, to be missed, have friendships, and so on. It's a very powerful proposition, and it's unique to us. Lots of people do programs and things, but the kinds of relationships that build within the heart of the worshiping community and its pastoral care of one another and its nurture of one another are really, really important in a time where social isolation and loneliness and not belonging and uncertainty, and I don't mean theological certainty, I just mean stuff changes. A liturgy carefully crafted is both familiar and new at the same time. The smell of a space you return to every week, the people you know. These are things we undersell or undervalue at our peril. We can't become more zappy and attractive. And, good communications is good. Working on your visual brand is good. But the brand is not what we look like, it's who we are. Right. And who we are as Christian communities are places where people gather from birth to death, intergenerationally, form bonds of friendship, affection, pastoral care, are nurtured in faith, are fed. And it's a place of respite and inspiration and challenge. So, it's hard to accept that that's all you got to do. That as a pastor, building relationships with your people is really, really important, and enabling relationships is really important. I used to teach pastoral ministry and sociology, and I used to say that a lot of clergy leaders especially have trouble with visiting people. Well, why would I do that? But I say, well, it's a survey of your parish. You're basically doing data collection, which will tell you everything you need to know about your parish. You will understand it better if you simply get to know people, and how you guide that community will be changed by your knowledge of all the parts, in a sense. These sound very almost colloquial, parochial, bucolic, but they're the important tools of church leadership. Presiding well at worship, taking care to make sure worship is not so much trendy and always changing, but what gives that blend of predictability, of challenge, of routine, the liturgical year that folds over and people mark time. So works of justice, advocacy, other types of programming are important, but if that's where you're seeking to hope that you will grow, or you might be missing the mark. At the heart, we are a gathered community of baptized individuals who gather around the table and care for one another as God would care for us. And then we leave that to try to make the world look that way. Much of that will not happen by corporate programs. Much of that will happen by the baptized going back to their contexts and making decisions that reflect the love and grace and justice of Christ.
Yeah, I appreciate kind of those notes about what basket to put your eggs into. I think that is helpful. I guess I am interested, though. I mean, you, as a bishop, you are kind of a pastor to the pastors, and you said, like, as primate, you have that pastoral role to the bishops. Like, how do you, like, we talk to so many church leaders who kind of struggle with the weight of expectations, with the task list that seems never ending, with the kind of savior complex that gets layered onto people, with the anxiety of the system, when you're trying to lead in an anxious system. Like, what are just sort of the pieces of encouragement that you would offer to leaders who are struggling with those things?
For sure. I think go gently, first of all, that the church belongs to God, not you. And that all shall be well in some way at some time. And, apart from the normal checking in, like, do you have a savior complex? Do you feel you're indispensable? Do you need to show up for everything? Like, just to, check in on that. Pastors need to understand that there is discretion over your time in most cases, and you don't need to tell people why you can't come to a meeting, but make sure you have time off. I found as a bishop, when I spoke with clergy, if they couldn't give me a nice story about what they did in their time off, I would say, well, you can tell me what your time on looks like, but you don't actually have a narrative around your most personal life. Like, what's that all about? Make sure you've got a lovely story, and it's okay. It's okay. And you don't need to explain that to anyone. So just personal self-care is very, very important. It's not selfish to take care of yourself. That's important. But I think it is necessary to look at it at a systemic level, that if the expectations are expectations based on an idea of church in a time that simply is no more, they need to be checked. Again, what is the environment we're living in right now? There is also the case that we perhaps need to address structures. Do we need all these parishes, all these churches that are struggling? Or do we need to somehow consolidate or create the conditions for them to thrive? I have never closed a church as bishop, but I have appealed to the wisdom and good sense of the people of God to say, if you think you're at the point where talk to me about it. And churches closed, people amalgamated, because the laity of the church, in my experience, are quite wise. They know when the jig is up, and you don't go in and close a church, but you need to give permission for people to look at their context and their resources. I like to use the word thrive to describe the aspirations or the ambitions of our church. We need to be a church that can thrive. I do not like the word grow. Because it's not a realistic word. It's also a very blunt marker, right? Thriving may lead to growth. It may lead to sustainability. It may lead, I don't know where. So what conditions allow you to thrive, right? yes, there's a matter of hard resources. You need a building. You need money to operate and to pay staff and so on. And good programs of stewardship will help with that. But mostly you need a community of love, a community where people want to be there, where they know and love their pastor. They take care of one another. They journey together through time as a social community, as much as a community of faith. In my experience, and you see this as a bishop where you're very privileged to go from community to community to community, the healthiest are the places where there are obvious friendships happening.
Yeah. That's interesting.
People come into the room and they feel the authentic friendships. We're glad you're here, and join in, and it doesn't matter who you are, Again, we don't place high value on that, but that's the one thing we propose in a time where that does not happen in many, many, many contexts and places, right?
Right.
Community of life, intergenerational, cared for, known, accepted, heard, understood, and gathers weekly, that ritual of simply being a human community together in a familiar place is a very important part of being a human being, it's your tribe.
Yeah, it truly is. Yeah. So I think you've offered like a number of pieces of what a thriving church could look like, about places where change is necessary, some notes about what that change could be oriented toward. What do you see the national church body's role being in helping the church navigate this season of change?
So I will speak specifically to the Anglican Church of Canada. Other people
of
might
course.
find. So, the National Church organization, the National Church is the bishops, parishes, dioceses, clergy, people, right? Like that's the National Church. But as an organization, the National Church needs to serve and support the interests of where ministry actually happens, which is in the dioceses and parishes and with the clergy and people and bishops of our church. So like the phenomenon faced by most parish churches, our national church has roots in an era when it was big and strong and seen to be important both within the church and outside the church. And there was a lot of heavy-duty program that happened and still happens in some national churches. And that is confusing in some ways because the locus of ministry is not a national body. It would be in the gathered communities called parishes, and maybe at some level in dioceses. But is the Anglican Church doing ministry when its national church does it, or is the Anglican Church doing ministry when any one part of it's doing it in its own context, right? So I think the reset, which has been called for unambiguously by the General Synod of the Anglican Church of Canada, is to consider what is the key and essential role of the national office, and that's to convene, to coordinate, and communicate, and to provide operational support to the dioceses that comprise the Anglican Church of Canada. And part of the convening and coordinating and communicating function is not so much to do programs, but to locate and identify individuals who have expertise, who might be doing work around migrant workers, for example, or human trafficking, or youth ministry, and to convene those players and support them as they become mutually supportive and share resources. So it's a very different model. Program is not happening in the national office. The talent, the ambition, the ministries, the skill is convened and coordinated so that there can be ministry happening in the Anglican Church of Canada in the context where it most matters, So the national office in many ways is oriented to serve the constituent parts of the church, not to be a body that is kind of doing its own thing, right? Or as a parallel thing. Now, in our tradition, the ministry of the primate, which is not about the person, it's about the connecting nationally continentally, internationally. That's very, very important. We are in communion with one another, with the Anglican Communion. We have a full communion relationship. There's ecumenical relationships. So supporting those relationships and building them is also an important national function. The Primate of Canada can bring the Anglican Church to any number of conversations, and that's important. So to make a long story short, I think the challenge which we will undertake is to create a national office which is seen to be directly valuable and supportive to the dioceses, the bishops, the clergy, and people in parishes of the Anglican Church of Canada. When you think of the General Synod or Church House, right, I know what that does, and it supports me in my ministry, or it's doing something that only it can uniquely do, right?
Right.
So it's a different structure. It needs to cost less. It needs to be self-funding wherever possible. And it needs to say to the dioceses, we actually need less money from you because we have focused on things that serve you. And wherever possible, we've leveraged the assets held by our church to fund it, right? So it's just, and that's true of a lot of synod offices as well,
I was just going to say, actually, do you see the translating to the diocesan level as well? Because I think that it has been so easy to see the individual parishes as supporting the broader structures of the Anglican Church. And in many ways, that kind of suits our Anglican temperament, because we like all of the bishops and the, pomp and circumstance and all of those things. But to really be clear about,
I take very seriously the fact that I have a significant title and place. But in my experience, and I learned this when I became the dean, Adrienne Clarkson had just been appointed Governor General, and she's an Anglican, as you know. And she helped me understand that if you have a job and a title, you use it to do good things. Don't apologize for it,
Yeah.
So I'm very aware. I would do nothing to diminish the office of primate, but It's not about aggrandizing me or, it doesn't have value in its own right. It has value because of the good things it can do in terms of being a symbol of unity, a gathering function, speaking for the church on important issues, and so on.
Yeah, that's really well said. Thank you. Okay, I have one more question before we take a quick break. You noted that you're 67 years old, that you need to retire at the age of 70. So you have sort of a 3-year mandate that's pretty clear cut. Yeah. What for you would signify to you at the end of those 3 years that the church is on the right pathway of change?
Well, I think the pathways is the operational word there. We did do a lot of consultation to create a document called Creating Pathways. There are 6 distinct pathways, which are clear. They need to be operationalized. They need to be brought into effect. I would hope that at the end of 3 years, we can look back and say we made significant progress on those 3 pathways, and they will lead to deep change. There's no question about it. So that would be important. As I consider our church at this time, there are sort of 3 areas, 3 pillars that we kind of stand on right now. One would be the pathways. The other would be our property, the property situation we face. And the third would be the staff and programming and operations of Church House. And I don't mean the building. I mean the staff of the central office and the various activities and operations that happen here. Each of those need to be addressed in their own right. There's some significant overlap between those 3 pillars, but I believe there can be measurable results in each of them, which would see us at the end of this triennium looking and feeling quite different and having a different understanding of how we resource our national office and how our national office is very much oriented to serve the interests of the constituent parts of the Anglican Church of Canada, while lifting up those roles that can only uniquely be done by the primate or by the central office.
Okay. Well, that sounds necessary and challenging and exciting. So,
exciting. It's good. It's good work. It's good work.
Good
work
work
that has to be done. Echoing back to the first part of our conversation, we need to understand our context and we need to guide change. Mm-hmm. And that means making decisions. And if we don't guide change, we will be changed. And that's not very nice.
Yeah. Yeah. That's absolutely the case, isn't it? Okay. Well, let's take a quick break and we'll come back for some closing questions. Welcome back to the Future Christian Podcast. I am with Archbishop Shane Parker, and we are going to wrap up with some closing questions. So, Archbishop, if you were Pope for a day, what would be the content of those 24 hours? And again, you can take these questions as seriously or not as you want.
Well, I have tremendous respect for the Roman Catholic tradition. I did my Anglican studies at a pontifical institute in Ottawa, St. Paul University, and a tremendous respect. So I offer these with a gentle edge. I would rapidly facilitate the ordination of women. It's quite clear that from an Anglican perspective at least, and I think even from a strict biblical perspective, that women were the first witnesses to the resurrection, the first apostles to the apostles, and that ministry is of tremendous value to the church. So that's something that I would do as well. Otherwise, I would probably echo some of the comments I made earlier. You know, I think our church needs to focus on ensuring that is a place of safety for everyone, a place of love, a place of intergenerational relationships, and so on. And I think I would use the influence I would have as Pope, which is significant because the Pope gets a lot of press, to speak to issues of justice, environmental justice, social justice, and as Pope Leo does, to influence wherever possible, creating an environment where the dignity of every human being is respected and people can live in safety and prosperity and thrive.
Well, that sounds like a very busy day for you, but those sound like really good things to aim for. Thank you. Was there a theological or historical Christian figure who you would want to meet, bring back to life, have lunch with? Who would that be?
I've never actually considered that question. I love the notion of the communion of the saints. I mean, surrounded by a great cloud of witnesses. And I have a very close friendship with Albert Dumont, who's an Algonquin spiritual teacher. And I always say to him, who found his way back into his traditional spirituality from a very rough road, that his ancestors called him home, you know, and I am very conscious of the heritage that I come from, as Celtic Christianity is sometimes used. And I can't think of an individual. I'm just conscious of my forebears in faith and those who, especially bishops, and I'm thinking of Cuthbert, for example, worker bishops. They had things to do. You know,
right.
the trappings weren't there. My favorite mode of dress as primate, as people will see, will be to wear a chasuble and to carry a small primatial staff instead of a big cross. I'm on the move, ready to work.
Okay. That's good. I like that. Ready to work, ready to move. What will history remember from our current time and place?
I believe history will remember that the church, even as it tried to celebrate its place in society, faced a major existential crisis, which allowed it to find its core and to celebrate its life with confident humility and find its way in a manner that touches the lives of many people and influences the course of history.
Oh, that's a very hopeful answer. That's great. And I guess connected to that, what is your hope for the future of Christianity? Or is that sort of the same answer?
Well, I think we're very clear from the prologue to John's Gospel that Christianity was and is already in the future, and because Christ is there. I think Christianity is I can speak as a sociologist that, people create religious structures, and those religious structures act to create people, right? So when I think of Christianity, I do think of Jesus. I do think of the core teaching of Jesus. I think of the kindness and compassion and courage and strength and justice and reconciliation, those deep qualities of God which Christ revealed to us. And I hope whatever the future of Christianity is that it embodies those values of Christ and makes them known in the world, regardless of the structures and decorations that might surround it in any one culture in any one point in time.
Yeah, thank you. Well said. Is there somewhere that people can find out more about you?
If you go to the Anglican Church of Canada's website, you'll probably find a little bit more. I haven't done it yet, but I'm quite sure if you simply Google me these days, there's been enough going on and lifted up that you can see that. I am on Facebook, Shane Parker on Facebook, and you can follow me. But I think the Anglican Church of Canada's website is probably the best place to go to find a bit more biographical information. I do write regularly and monthly reflections. I've been doing that for many years. So if you want to know more about my spirituality, I think, as much as my ecclesiology, read some of the things that are published in the Anglican Journal and other places.
Okay, thank you very much. Well, we always end with a word of peace. So thank you so much for your time, Archbishop Parker, and may the peace of Christ be with you.
Thank you very much, Martha, and also with you.
Thanks for joining us on the Future Christian Podcast. The Future Christian Podcast is produced by Resonate Media. We love to hear from our listeners with questions, comments, and ideas for future episodes. Visit our website at future-christian.com and find the Connect with Us form at the bottom of the page to get in touch with Martha or Lauren. But before you go, do us a favor. Subscribe to the pod to leave a review. It really helps us get this out to more people. Thanks, and go in peace.